dangerous moment in modern American politics is not when voices are raised or accusations are shouted, but when certainty is delivered calmly enough that people stop asking where it came from. That is the moment when power no longer argues but assumes, and when the audience is invited to trust tone instead of substance, confidence instead of proof. Someone in the room breaks the silence and asks why this feels like an attack rather than oversight, why the questioning sounds personal instead of procedural, and why the tension keeps rising instead of resolving. The answer is simple but uncomfortable, and it will not fully reveal itself until the end. So stay with this story long enough to see the pattern instead of just the spark. Because what unfolds here is not a single clash of personalities, but a slow collision between two political instincts that now define Washington itself. The hearing room looks ordinary in the way all consequential rooms try to look ordinary, with neutral lighting, polished desks, and an atmosphere designed to suggest order even when conflict is inevitable. Adam Schiff enters carrying the authority of someone who has learned how to speak with moral certainty, the kind that signals seriousness and discourages interruption before a question is even finished. Kash Patel enters with a different posture entirely, one that suggests patience rather than urgency, as if he believes time itself will eventually do more damage than confrontation ever could. From the very beginning, it is clear that this is not a discussion about a single document or isolated statement, but about who gets to define credibility in the public mind. The cameras settle in because everyone involved understands that this room is not just for the people present, but for millions who will consume this exchange later in fragments. Schiff opens with language that feels familiar to anyone who follows Washington closely, invoking responsibility, national interest, and the need to protect institutions from reckless doubt. His words are carefully constructed to frame skepticism as a threat, not merely a disagreement, because once skepticism is framed that way, questioning becomes suspect by definition. Patel does not interrupt, does not object, and does not roll his eyes, which in this environment is itself a provocation, because calm refusal to react often reads as confidence. The contrast between them begins to sharpen, not because one is louder than the other, but because they are speaking to different versions of the audience. One speaks to those who want reassurance that the system is sound, while the other speaks to those who suspect the system only sounds confident because it rarely answers plainly. As Schiff continues, his tone grows firmer, leaning into the idea that leadership requires decisiveness and that hesitation signals weakness to adversaries watching from afar. It is an argument that has emotional weight, especially in a country conditioned to equate strength with certainty and doubt with danger. Patel finally responds, not by challenging Schiff's motives, but by questioning the relationship between confidence and accuracy, a distinction that immediately shifts the ground beneath the exchange. He suggests carefully that decisiveness is only valuable when it rests on verifiable foundations, and that confidence without accountability becomes performance rather than leadership. The room reacts subtly, because this is no longer a disagreement about policy, but about how truth is communicated and sold. From my own perspective, and I say this directly because pretending neutrality would be dishonest, this is where modern political conflict becomes most revealing. Washington has learned how to package conviction so well that the packaging itself is often mistaken for evidence, and that habit is rewarded far more often than restraint. Schiff represents a style that believes clarity must be projected outward, even when internal complexity remains unresolved, because ambiguity erodes public trust. Patel represents a style that believes unresolved complexity should be admitted openly, even if it unsettles the public, because false clarity eventually destroys trust anyway. Neither instinct is purely malicious, but both become dangerous when insulated from challenge. The tension escalates when Schiff implies that questioning too aggressively risks undermining national cohesion, a phrase that lands heavily in a room filled with institutional loyalty. Patel responds by asking whether cohesion built on unexamined assertions is durable or merely convenient until reality intrudes. It is a quiet question, delivered without edge, which makes it harder to dismiss as theatrics. A few people in the gallery shift in their seats because the question does not accuse. It invites reflection, and reflection is far more destabilizing than outrage. This is the first moment where the exchange stops feeling like a hearing and starts feeling like a test of public patience. Schiff tightens his response, emphasizing experience, continuity, and the dangers of empowering doubt in an already fractured political environment. Patel listens, nods once, and then reframes the issue by suggesting that doubt does not fracture systems, but exposes fractures that already exist. That reframing matters because it challenges the idea that silence preserves stability, and instead suggests that silence delays reckoning. The cameras linger because this is the kind of line that will circulate without context, interpreted as either courage or recklessness depending on who is watching. And that is precisely why this moment matters more than any single factual dispute raised in the room. As Part 1 closes, nothing has been resolved. No accusation has been proven, and no institution has been condemned outright. What has happened instead is the introduction of a deeper conflict, one that cannot be settled by documents alone. It is the conflict between certainty as a tool of leadership and skepticism as a tool of accountability. The audience is left not with answers, but with a growing unease about which tool they have been trained to trust. And that unease is exactly what will drive the confrontation forward into what comes next. By the time the exchange moves deeper into its second phase, it becomes clear that neither man is actually arguing about facts alone, because facts are rarely what decide reputations in Washington anymore. What they are really contesting is who gets to define the emotional frame through which those facts will later be remembered, interpreted, and repeated. Schiff understands this instinctively, which is why he begins anchoring his statements not to documents, but to consequences, because consequences resonate longer than footnotes. He speaks about damage, about erosion of trust, about the invisible costs that arise when officials appear divided in moments of national vulnerability. The implication is subtle but unmistakable. Doubt is not neutral, and asking the wrong questions at the wrong time carries moral weight. Patel responds by refusing to accept the premise that timing alone determines legitimacy, because he knows that premise can be used to permanently defer accountability. He argues that there is never a convenient moment to examine power, and that postponing scrutiny in the name of unity often means scrutiny never arrives at all. Rather than framing his challenge as opposition, he frames it as responsibility, suggesting that responsibility delayed is responsibility denied. This rhetorical shift matters because it places the burden back on leadership rather than on critics. The room feels the shift immediately because responsibility is harder to weaponize than rebellion. Schiff senses the danger in that framing and moves quickly to recast Patel's posture as one of persistent suspicion rather than measured oversight. He suggests that there is a line between healthy questioning and corrosive doubt, and that Patel has stepped dangerously close to crossing it. The word corrosive hangs in the air because it implies slow damage, invisible decay, something that weakens structures quietly from within. Patel does not reject the word outright, which would sound defensive, but instead asks who decides where that line is drawn. The question exposes the power dynamic underlying the entire exchange, because whoever defines the line controls the conversation. From my perspective, this is where the debate shifts from performance into something more revealing, because it exposes how authority often operates without admitting it. Schiff speaks as someone accustomed to defining boundaries, confident that his experience grants him the right to do so. Patel speaks as someone challenging the legitimacy of those boundaries, not by tearing them down, but by asking how they were constructed in the first place. This is not rebellion in the theatrical sense, but recalibration. And recalibration is far more unsettling to established power. The audience senses this intuitively, even if they cannot articulate it, which is why attention in the room intensifies rather than dissipates. Schiff attempts to regain narrative control by invoking precedent, reminding everyone that institutions survive because leaders respect established norms. He argues that norms are fragile and that constant interrogation risks turning governance into perpetual crisis management. Patel agrees that norms matter, then asks whether norms that cannot withstand interrogation are truly norms or merely habits that have avoided scrutiny. The distinction is subtle but devastating because it reframes respect for norms as conditional rather than absolute. At that moment, precedent stops being a shield and starts becoming a question mark. The tension sharpens as Schiff leans into his role as institutional guardian, someone tasked with protecting systems larger than any individual. He warns that delegitimizing authority can open doors that cannot easily be closed, especially in an era of misinformation and foreign influence. Patel listens carefully, then responds that authority which cannot explain itself clearly becomes indistinguishable from authority that merely asserts itself. He emphasizes that explanation is not weakness, but proof of legitimacy. The implication is uncomfortable because it suggests that the refusal to explain signals fragility rather than strength. The gallery reacts unevenly because this is no longer a partisan exchange that neatly divides along ideological lines. Some hear Schiff's warnings as necessary caution, while others hear them as a plea to stop asking inconvenient questions. Some hear Patel's skepticism as overdue accountability, while others hear it as an invitation to chaos. The divide is not ideological so much as psychological, separating those who crave reassurance from those who crave transparency. This is why the exchange feels heavier than it looks, because it is tapping into competing emotional needs within the public. Schiff presses forward by emphasizing outcomes, pointing to past decisions as evidence that leadership guided by conviction produces results. He frames uncertainty as paralysis, suggesting that leaders who hesitate risk leaving vacuums others will exploit. Patel counters that outcomes achieved through overstated certainty may succeed in the short term, but corrode credibility in the long term. He argues that credibility, once lost, cannot be restored by authority alone. This introduces a temporal dimension to the debate, pitting immediate effectiveness against long-term trust. At this stage, the exchange has fully moved beyond the specifics that originally justified the hearing. What remains is a confrontation over political philosophy disguised as procedural oversight. Schiff believes the public needs leaders who project confidence even amid ambiguity, because fear thrives in visible hesitation. Patel believes the public needs leaders who admit uncertainty honestly, because fear thrives when people sense they are being managed rather than informed. Neither belief is easily disproven, which is precisely why the clash persists. As Part 2 draws to a close, the atmosphere in the room has changed noticeably. Voices are quieter, but attention is sharper, because the debate has become less about winning and more about exposing assumptions. No one has accused the other of criminal intent, and no single fact has definitively resolved the tension. Instead, the audience is left with a growing realization that the conflict is structural rather than personal. And that realization sets the stage for what follows, when rhetoric gives way to pattern, and pattern becomes impossible to ignore. By the third phase of the exchange, the conversation begins drifting backward in time, not as a nostalgic exercise, but as a strategic excavation of memory. Schiff understands that memory is not merely recollection, but curation, and he begins selecting moments from the past that reinforce his authority while quietly discarding those that complicate it. He references earlier hearings, past crises, and moments when decisive leadership appeared to prevent national unraveling. Each example is delivered with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to being believed when invoking history. The message is implicit, but unmistakable. Trust me, because I have been right before. Patel does not challenge the accuracy of those memories directly, because he knows that doing so would trap him in a defensive posture. Instead, he questions the completeness of the story, suggesting that what is remembered often depends on what is deliberately forgotten. He notes that institutional memory has a tendency to polish itself over time, smoothing sharp edges until accountability fades into abstraction. This is not an accusation, but an observation, and its restraint makes it harder to dismiss. The audience senses that something uncomfortable is being approached, even if it has not yet been named. Schiff responds by framing memory as continuity, arguing that stable governance depends on a shared understanding of past decisions. He warns that constantly reopening settled debates risks destabilizing public confidence. Patel listens, then asks whether public confidence built on selective memory is sustainable or merely convenient. The question hangs in the air longer than Schiff would like, because it suggests that confidence and truth may not always align. For a brief moment, Schiff hesitates, and that hesitation does not go unnoticed. From where I sit, this hesitation matters more than any raised voice, because it reveals the tension between certainty and scrutiny. Schiff has spent years operating in environments where deference is routine and dissent is carefully managed. Patel is intentionally disrupting that rhythm, not through confrontation, but through persistence. Persistence forces acknowledgement, and acknowledgement forces explanation. This is why the exchange feels heavier now than earlier, because explanations require exposure. Schiff pivots by invoking expertise, emphasizing classified briefings, closed-door sessions, and information unavailable to the public. He suggests that some judgments cannot be fully explained without compromising security or process. Patel agrees that secrecy has a place, then asks how the public can evaluate decisions they are told they cannot understand. He frames the issue as a democratic dilemma rather than a personal dispute. The implication is clear. Secrecy may be necessary, but it is never neutral. The room reacts subtly, because many in the audience recognize this tension from their own experiences with authority. They have been told to trust processes they cannot see, justified by threats they cannot verify. Schiff's argument resonates with those who fear disorder, while Patel's resonates with those who fear manipulation. Neither fear is irrational, which makes the conflict more profound. This is not about right versus wrong, but about competing definitions of responsibility. Schiff attempts to regain momentum by questioning Patel's consistency, suggesting that skepticism applied selectively can become ideology disguised as inquiry. He implies that Patel's questions are not neutral, but guided by an underlying agenda. Patel does not deny having a perspective, because denying it would sound dishonest. Instead, he argues that perspective does not invalidate questions, just as authority does not sanctify answers. This reframing shifts the focus from motive to substance, where Schiff is less comfortable. As the exchange deepens, humor slips in unexpectedly, lightening the tension without dissolving it. Patel jokes that if questioning authority were truly corrosive, Washington would have dissolved decades ago. A few nervous laughs ripple through the room, not because the joke is hilarious, but because it carries truth. Schiff smiles tightly, recognizing the danger of humor that exposes structural absurdities. Even laughter, it seems, can undermine hierarchy. Schiff counters with dry irony of his own, remarking that skepticism is easier from the outside than from the chair responsible for outcomes. The line draws applause from some quarters because it flatters the burden of leadership. Patel responds that responsibility should sharpen humility rather than dull curiosity. The contrast is stark because one sees responsibility as justification, while the other sees it as obligation. The audience begins to sense that these men are arguing from fundamentally different definitions of power. By now, the original topic that brought them into the room feels almost irrelevant. What matters is the pattern emerging from how each man navigates uncertainty. Schiff manages uncertainty by narrowing it, compressing ambiguity into decisive narratives. Patel manages uncertainty by expanding it, insisting that unresolved questions remain visible rather than buried. Both approaches have consequences, and the audience is being asked, implicitly, to choose which feels more honest. As this part of the exchange winds down, there is a noticeable shift in posture across the room. People are no longer waiting for a dramatic clash, but for clarification. They want to know whether confidence should be earned through transparency or asserted through experience. No one says this aloud, but it is written on faces and reflected in silence. That silence is not agreement, but anticipation. And it signals that the debate is about to enter a far more personal phase. At this stage, the exchange can no longer hide behind abstraction, because abstraction has done its work and cleared the path for confrontation. What now sits between John Kennedy and Adam Schiff is not theory, but record, not interpretation, but consequence. The air in the room feels denser, as if everyone senses that something irreversible is approaching, even if no one can yet name it. This is the moment when rhetoric stops being a shield and starts becoming evidence. Both men know it, and that shared awareness sharpens every word that follows. Schiff begins by tightening his language, abandoning expansive historical framing in favor of precision. He cites dates, quotes prior statements, and leans heavily on the authority of official findings, emphasizing conclusions rather than processes. His voice is steady, practiced, and confident, the voice of someone who has survived many hearings by controlling tempo. The strategy is familiar: overwhelm with structure, compress complexity, and project inevitability. If the facts appear settled, then the debate itself can be framed as unnecessary. Kennedy does not interrupt, which unsettles Schiff more than any objection could have. Instead, Kennedy lets Schiff finish, creating a silence that feels deliberate rather than passive. When he speaks, he does not contest the conclusions directly, but asks about the path that led to them. He wants to know who spoke first, who verified second, and who decided that doubt was no longer useful. These are not hostile questions, but they are dangerous ones, because they reopen closed doors. From my perspective, this is where the power dynamic begins to tilt. Schiff is strongest when defending outcomes, because outcomes imply finality. Kennedy is strongest when examining sequences, because sequences imply choice. Choice invites responsibility, and responsibility invites judgment. The audience senses this shift intuitively, even if they cannot articulate it yet. Schiff responds by warning against retrospective purity, arguing that decisions must be judged in the context of the information available at the time. He stresses urgency, uncertainty, and the weight of national security. The implication is that hesitation would have been irresponsible, even dangerous. Kennedy listens, then asks whether urgency excuses certainty or whether it demands restraint. The question lands quietly, but its implications ripple outward. At this point, Schiff's composure begins to show faint cracks, not through anger, but through acceleration. His sentences shorten, his pacing quickens, and his tone becomes slightly sharper. This is not loss of control, but an attempt to regain it by tightening grip. Kennedy, by contrast, slows down, elongating his sentences and lowering his volume. The contrast makes Schiff sound reactive, and Kennedy sound deliberate, regardless of substance. The audience reacts unevenly, split not along party lines, but along temperament. Those who value decisiveness nod at Schiff's insistence on action. Those who value caution lean toward Kennedy's insistence on process. The room becomes a quiet referendum on how people want power to behave. Not loudly, not emotionally, but unmistakably. Schiff attempts a pivot by questioning Kennedy's motives, suggesting that constant scrutiny can erode trust in institutions already under strain. He frames Kennedy's approach as corrosive, hinting that it feeds public cynicism rather than constructive reform. Kennedy acknowledges the risk, then counters that blind trust erodes institutions far faster than skepticism ever could. He argues that credibility is not preserved by silence, but by accountability. This is the first moment where applause breaks out spontaneously before being quickly suppressed. Humor surfaces again, briefly and sharply, as Kennedy remarks that institutions strong enough to survive the truth rarely fear questions. The line earns a restrained chuckle because it feels less like a joke and more like a verdict. Schiff smiles, but the smile does not reach his eyes. He knows that humor framed this way is difficult to rebut without sounding defensive. Even levity, in this moment, has a cutting edge. Schiff returns to authority, invoking the burden of leadership and the loneliness of decision-making. He describes nights spent reviewing briefings, weighing incomplete data, and choosing between imperfect options. The description is vivid enough to humanize him, and for a moment, the room softens. Kennedy does not dismiss this, but asks whether burden justifies certainty, or whether it should deepen doubt. The softness evaporates, replaced by renewed tension. By now, the debate has become less about what happened and more about how power justifies itself after the fact. Schiff defends authority by emphasizing experience and institutional trust. Kennedy challenges authority by emphasizing transparency and moral restraint. Neither position is frivolous, which is why the exchange feels so heavy. There is no easy villain here, only incompatible philosophies colliding in real time. What strikes me most in this moment is not what is said, but what is avoided. Schiff avoids acknowledging the emotional cost of certainty proven wrong. Kennedy avoids claiming moral superiority, instead framing his critique as procedural necessity. Both men are protecting something vital to their identities. The audience senses that the next phase will force one of them to yield ground. As Part 4 draws to a close, the room feels suspended between confrontation and confession. The questions are no longer hypothetical, and the answers are no longer abstract. What comes next will require one of them to confront not just the other, but himself. The silence that follows is no longer anticipation, but unease. And unease, once introduced, has a way of demanding resolution. By now, the debate has crossed a threshold that neither man can retreat from without paying a price, because the audience is no longer listening for answers, but watching for fractures. This is the stage where posture matters as much as argument, and hesitation is interpreted as confession, even when it is not. Every pause is read, every breath analyzed, and every shift in tone magnified by cameras that never blink. The room does not feel hostile, but it feels unforgiving, as if neutrality itself has left the building. What remains is judgment waiting to be activated. Schiff senses the danger first, not because he lacks confidence, but because he understands theater, and politics at this level is always theater layered over substance. He straightens, squares his shoulders, and returns to a cadence that signals command, the rhythm of someone accustomed to being believed. His words now emphasize responsibility, gravity, and the weight of consequence, as though authority itself were the final credential. He speaks of protecting norms, of preventing chaos, of guarding institutions from reckless doubt. The subtext is clear. Stability requires trust, and trust requires deference. Kennedy does not challenge this framing head-on, which is precisely what makes his response unsettling. Instead, he asks whether stability that cannot survive scrutiny is stability at all, or merely stagnation dressed up as order. He wonders aloud whether institutions collapse because they are questioned, or because they are shielded from questions for too long. The phrasing is calm, almost reflective, but the implication is sharp enough to cut through the room. This is not an attack on authority, but an interrogation of its self-image. From where I sit, this moment reveals the deepest divide between them, not ideological, but psychological. Schiff believes legitimacy flows from role, from process, from accumulated trust in systems. Kennedy believes legitimacy flows from restraint, from doubt, from the willingness to say less rather than more. Neither belief is inherently radical, but when placed side by side, they are irreconcilable. The audience feels that tension even if they cannot name it. The temperature in the room shifts again as public reaction begins to seep inward. Phones buzz quietly as aides receive messages, social media updates, and early clips already circulating beyond the chamber walls. Both men know that this exchange is no longer contained, that it has escaped into the wider ecosystem of opinion. What is said now will not be interpreted generously by strangers watching in fragments. That awareness adds pressure, compressing time and narrowing margin for error. Schiff leans into moral certainty, suggesting that ambiguity can be weaponized by those acting in bad faith. He warns that relentless questioning can empower cynicism, misinformation, and paralysis. The warning is sincere, and it resonates with part of the audience that fears disorder more than error. Kennedy acknowledges the risk, then asks whether fear of misuse justifies withholding clarity. The question lingers, unanswered, and the silence around it feels intentional. Humor surfaces again, but this time it is brittle rather than light. Kennedy remarks that if doubt is dangerous, then certainty must be treated as hazardous material. A few restrained laughs ripple through the room, more nervous than amused. Schiff does not smile this time, and the absence is noted. Even humor, it seems, has chosen a side. At this point, the debate becomes less about facts and more about temperament under pressure. Schiff's confidence begins to feel rehearsed, not false, but over-polished, like something designed to withstand storms rather than adapt to them. Kennedy's calm begins to feel strategic, not passive, a deliberate refusal to escalate. The contrast invites comparison, And comparison invites judgment. The audience starts measuring character rather than credibility. I find myself thinking that this is where political careers are quietly reshaped, not through scandal, but through exposure. Exposure to one's own habits, one's own reflexes, one's own assumptions about how power should sound when challenged. Schiff's language reflects a lifetime inside institutions, defending them by invoking their necessity. Kennedy's language reflects a lifetime around institutions, questioning them by invoking their limits. Neither man is improvising, which makes the collision more revealing. The moderator attempts to steer the exchange back toward procedural ground, but the effort feels symbolic rather than effective. The audience has already moved past procedure and into interpretation. They are not asking who is right, but who seems more trustworthy under stress. That is an unfair metric, perhaps, but politics has never been a fair arena. It rewards perception as ruthlessly as it rewards proof. Schiff senses the shift and makes a final attempt to reclaim narrative control by appealing directly to the public. He speaks about responsibility to voters, to allies, to history itself, framing his actions as part of a larger moral arc. The language is elevated, almost ceremonial, and for a moment it regains ground. Kennedy listens, then responds not with counter-argument, but with a simple observation about humility. He suggests that history is rarely kind to those who claim to speak for it too confidently. That line lands harder than any accusation could have. It does not accuse Schiff of wrongdoing, but of overreach, which is far more difficult to refute. Overreach is not illegal, not even immoral, but it is often fatal to credibility. The room reacts not with noise, but with stillness, the kind that signals absorption. Everyone senses that something has shifted again. As Part 5 draws toward its end, the debate feels less like a contest and more like a reckoning in slow motion. Neither man has collapsed, neither has triumphed. But the equilibrium has changed. The audience is no longer deciding whom to support, but what kind of leadership they are willing to tolerate. That is a heavier question, and it does not resolve cleanly. The silence that settles afterward is not empty, but weighted with implication. What comes next will not be louder, but it will be deeper. The final phase will not hinge on arguments, but on consequences, both spoken and unspoken. One of these men will leave this exchange unchanged, and the other will not. The difference will not be obvious immediately, but it will be permanent. And the audience, Chavomas, whether they realize it or not, is already part of that outcome. When the room finally empties and the microphones are switched off, what lingers is not a single sentence or exchange, but a feeling that something subtle yet irreversible has occurred. No dramatic collapse has taken place, no decisive winner declared, and yet the balance between authority and accountability feels permanently altered. This is how many consequential moments in American politics actually end. Not with fireworks, but with a quiet recalibration of trust. The audience leaves without applause, carrying questions instead of conclusions. That absence of closure is not accidental. It is the true outcome. Outside the chamber, interpretation begins immediately, as it always does, filtered through headlines, clips, and selective emphasis. Supporters of John Kennedy praise restraint, clarity, and an insistence on process over proclamation. Supporters of Adam Schiff defend decisiveness, experience, and the necessity of firm leadership in uncertain times. Each side believes it has witnessed validation rather than challenge. The division does not widen dramatically, but it deepens, settling into more entrenched shapes. What strikes me most in the aftermath is how differently silence is interpreted. For some, Kennedy's refusal to escalate reads as confidence rooted in patience. For others, it reads as strategic ambiguity designed to avoid full commitment. Schiff's assertiveness is seen by some as moral courage, and by others as institutional overreach. The same behaviors generate opposite conclusions depending on what the viewer already believes. This is the paradox of modern political persuasion, where performance rarely changes minds, but often hardens them. The exchange did not convert skeptics into believers or believers into skeptics. Instead, it clarified the terms of disagreement, making them harder to ignore. That clarification may be uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. Democracy, after all, depends less on consensus than on honest conflict. In the days that follow, commentary frames the debate as a referendum on leadership style rather than policy substance. Pundits dissect tone, cadence, and facial expression with forensic intensity. Clips circulate showing moments of hesitation and moments of certainty, each edited to support opposing narratives. What gets lost is the deeper question raised but never resolved. How much certainty should power claim when evidence is incomplete? From my perspective, this unresolved tension is precisely the point. Kennedy's approach suggests that humility in the face of uncertainty is a form of responsibility. Schiff's approach suggests that decisiveness in the face of risk is a form of duty. Both positions appeal to legitimate fears: fear of paralysis on one side, fear of manipulation on the other. The debate forces the audience to confront which fear they find more tolerable. There is also a quieter consequence unfolding beneath the public discourse. Staffers, aides, and institutional actors absorb these moments as signals about acceptable behavior. They learn what kinds of questions are rewarded and what kinds of answers are protected. They observe whether transparency is treated as strength or liability. Those lessons shape future decisions long after cameras move on. The exchange also reveals something uncomfortable about how authority is remembered. Power often believes it will be judged by intention, while the public judges it by impact. Schiff speaks frequently of intent, of responsibility assumed in real time. Kennedy speaks more often of consequence, of how decisions echo beyond their moment. Neither language is sufficient on its own, which is why the tension remains unresolved. Humor, which briefly punctuated earlier phases, disappears entirely by the end. There is no room for levity when stakes are framed this way. The absence of jokes feels appropriate, even sobering. It reminds everyone involved that what is being debated is not personality, but precedent. Precedent has a long memory, even when people do not. As the audience reflects, a subtle discomfort emerges, not with either man individually, but with the system that places them in opposition. A system that rewards certainty on television and punishes doubt, even when doubt is warranted. A system that equates confidence with competence and hesitation with weakness. Both Kennedy and Schiff are products of that system, even as they critique it from different angles. That realization complicates any attempt to assign blame cleanly. I find myself returning to the moment when neither man spoke, when the room sat suspended between question and answer. That pause felt more honest than any statement made before or after. It acknowledged uncertainty without trying to conquer it. It invited reflection rather than allegiance. In that pause, the audience briefly became participants rather than spectators. What happens next will not be decided by this exchange alone. Legislative calendars will continue, elections will approach, and new controversies will replace old ones. Yet this moment will resurface whenever similar questions arise about trust, secrecy, and responsibility. It will be cited selectively, remembered imperfectly, and argued over repeatedly. That is the fate of unresolved debates in democratic systems. Neither John Kennedy nor Adam Schiff leaves this encounter unchanged, even if the changes are not immediately visible. One carries the burden of restraint into a culture that rewards spectacle. The other carries the burden of certainty into a culture increasingly skeptical of authority. Both burdens are heavy, and neither guarantees redemption. What matters is how they are carried going forward. For the audience, the final question is not who won, but what was revealed. Was power shown to be more accountable or merely more articulate? Was skepticism elevated as civic duty or dismissed as obstruction? Was certainty exposed as confidence or as convenience? These questions resist tidy answers, which is why they endure. As the lights dim and attention shifts elsewhere, the echo of the debate remains. It is not an echo of insults or applause, but of unresolved responsibility, the kind that follows institutions long after individuals move on, the kind that forces citizens to decide what they expect from those who govern them. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all lingers in the silence left behind. When those entrusted with power speak with absolute certainty, and those who question them speak with deliberate restraint, which voice should democracy trust more, and at what cost?